This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host G. Sampath. The National People's Power, or the NPP, the ruling alliance led by President Anura Kumara Dissanayake, has secured a historic mandate in Sri Lanka's parliamentary elections. By winning 159 seats in the 225-member parliament, it has secured a two-thirds majority, and this is a feat that has never been achieved before in Sri Lanka's proportionate representation system. And this victory, coming 2 months after his election as president, leaves Dissanayake supremely well placed to fulfill the expectations of the people who have put their faith in him. But then, at the same time, he will also be under pressure from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, to stick with the program, which is basically a program of what seems like permanent austerity. Can he navigate these contradictory pulls on his government? And if so, what would be his approach? And how can he possibly use his two-thirds majority to establish a new political culture, a collective yearning that has played a definite role in his ascent to power? We discuss these questions and more in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us Dr. Aylan Kadirgamar from the University of Jaffna. Aylan, welcome to In Focus and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Sampath.
Great. So Aylan, to start with, I was wondering if you can share your thoughts, your understanding of the entire phenomenon of the rise of AKD, as he's come to be known, Anura Kumara Dissanayake, his triumph in the presidential race, and then a much more decisive landslide majority in the parliament. How do you view this entire development?
Yes, Sampath. It was kind of a surprise for, I think, many people, particularly the recent parliamentary election results. Because just a few years ago, nobody would have imagined that the NPP, with its main party, the JVP, the Janata Vipermuna, would be able to come to the helm of state power. Because the JVP, as you know, was an organization that carried out two major insurrections in the early 70s and then in the late 80s. But once they took the parliamentary path, and particularly with the economic crisis 2 years ago, the one where the people chased away President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and then the Rajapaksas installed President Ranil Wickremesinghe, who, brought about heavy repression to try to control any kind of protests. The NPP decided not to challenge them on the street and waited patiently for 2 years for the elections. And that strategy worked. It came to the presidential elections, partly because the elite could not work together. Ranil Wickremesinghe and Sajith Premadasa, until a few years ago, who were part of the same party, decided to contest, and it became a three-way race, which gave the edge to Dissanayake. Having won the president, and that too without a majority in the first round, there was then a kind of a wave, a much bigger wave towards the NPP. And I would say, that was probably caused by three factors. One, Anura Kumara Dissanayake was very charismatic, and he drew a lot of people, and people became more confident that this non-establishment party could deliver on change. Two, it was also an anti-incumbent force. So, for example, in the minority strongholds, for example, the North and East, even there, the NPP was able to gain much ground because of people, including the Tamil people, wanting a change from the dominant Tamil nationalist political parties because they felt that they had no confidence in them, that they had not delivered anything. So they wanted system change, as it was called in Sri Lanka, in the north just as much in the south. And third, what we've seen with most elections is that once when we have both the presidential election followed by the parliamentary election, when a party wins the presidency, the people are likely to give them also the mandate in the parliamentary elections. But nobody expected a two-thirds majority in parliament, because that gives a huge mandate to the NPP. And particularly with the proportional representation system, it's virtually impossible unless it is swept throughout the country as the NPP did. And two-thirds majority is important because for any major constitutional amendment, we need a two-thirds majority. So now, effectively, the NPP has the possibility of changing the constitution, which was part of their election campaign. And it is to be seen whether, for example, they will abolish the executive presidency, which was brought about in the late 70s. J.R. Jayawardena, who came on a similar landslide victory in 1977, that too during the long economic downturn, he brought about the presidential system. Until then, we were just a Westminster parliamentary system. And that gave huge amount of power to one individual. I would characterize it as almost a sort of an authoritarian office. So whether the NPP would now finally abolish the executive presidency, would they move on a new constitution that addresses the aspirations of the minorities? That is to be seen in the months ahead.
Right. Aylan, you mentioned just now that especially in the north, the NPP or the JVP, so to speak, they were able to win a good chunk of votes because there was a lot of anti-incumbency sentiment. I was just wondering, was that the only factor? Because JVP has had a past of being militant Sinhala nationalist outfit, and they have also been like very militantly anti-Tamil during the Civil War era. So how does that reconcile with the kind of significant number of seats they won in these Tamil majority districts in the north? And was it like just a vote against the existing traditional Tamil parties, or there were also many who actually saw in him maybe a transformed a political personality with a different worldview to what he was, or he may have been, or his party may have been in its earlier avatar in the 80s and the 90s?
Yeah, I think there was a sizable shift even from the presidential elections to the parliamentary elections. The NPP and particularly Dissanayake were able to give the people a considerable amount of confidence. They took some measures soon after. They opened one of the important roads in the high security zone in Jaffna. And when Dissanayake came for the election rally in Jaffna, he mentioned that he will release military-held land that has been held by the military, and then also other lands that have been grabbed by the archaeology ministry and the forest department and so on, that he would release those in the days, in the months after the election. So
was there any shift in terms of the demands of the Tamils regarding the entire this white van business, these enforced disappearances? Has he promised that they will be investigated? Any movement on that front?
No, that was not discussed in the election campaigns. In terms of the northern population and the eastern population, the hill country, I think, and this is across the country as well, I think what we saw in this election is that unlike the traditional political demands, people are really looking for economic relief. And the reason is that Sri Lanka is going through the worst economic crisis since probably the Great Depression of the 1930s. There's malnutrition. People in many rural households are only eating 2 meals a day. There's a high level of school dropouts. A lot of people are leaving the country in search of greener pastures. So they're looking for change, particularly in terms of addressing the economic situation. And I think that spoke a lot to the people in the North and East as well, because Tamil politics never engages with the question of livelihoods or the economic travails of the people.
Right. I mean, the economy is, of course, the biggest factor in everything we've seen from, say, the COVID-19, which sort of decimated the tourist economy of the country, followed by the 2022 economic crisis and the entire people's movement to where we are today. Now, the biggest factor in Sri Lanka's recovery from the economic morass it finds itself in is, of course, the IMF and the relief package of $2.9 billion it is supposed to provide Sri Lanka. Now, this money doesn't come easily. I mean, it is now conducting its third review right now in the country, and that review will determine the next tranche of 337 million US dollars, which should come to Sri Lanka if all goes well. Now, there are going to be these conditionalities from the IMF, its structural adjustment programs, austerity related measures, and other measures also as part of this so-called reform agenda, quote unquote reform agenda. So can you give us a quick overview of what exactly is the debt scenario right now for the country, and also what are the IMF conditionalities which are going to be maybe challenging for the new regime to handle?
When Sri Lanka defaulted on its external debt in April 2022, about 2.5 years ago, they announced that they will be seeking an IMF program and that they would move on debt restructuring. Now, when a country defaults, the current sort of global architecture is that then the IMF becomes the arbiter for debt restructuring. And the IMF does what's called a debt sustainability analysis, on the basis of which they provide a framework as to how much a country can repay to its creditors and over what period of time. So the IMF program has two major conditionalities. One, that Sri Lanka should show a primary budget surplus of 2.3% of GDP. And two, that it should show progress with debt restructuring. Now, 2.3% primary budget surplus is a very tall order, because until a few years back, Sri Lanka's primary budget's deficit was about 3.7%. So that's a net change of almost 6% of GDP. Primary budget surplus means that your revenue has to be higher than your expenditure and calculated in GDP terms. So what we've seen over the last 2 years even is a huge reduction in government expenditure and a huge rise in taxation. And that has also led to the further contraction of the economy, because there's no stimulus on the part of the government. So this primary budget surplus has come under considerable criticism, because if you look at Sri Lanka's best performing peers, they all, record a deficit, around a 1% deficit. So why is Sri Lanka being pushed to show such a high surplus, particularly at the time when the government needs to be stimulating more, it needs to be providing relief to the people? The reason, of course, is that all that is necessary to repay the creditors. And what we've seen the last few months is that the negotiations with the creditors, and particularly a large chunk of our debt is to the bondholders. Like many developing countries, Sri Lanka started borrowing in the international capital markets, floating what are called international sovereign bonds, in the late 2000s, about 15 years ago, during the time of the global financial crisis, when all these big hedge funds wanted higher returns. So they started lending to developing countries, what they call emerging markets. So many of those countries have also defaulted, whether it's Ghana, Zambia, around the same time as Sri Lanka. We all started borrowing in the international capital markets at the same time, and now we've defaulted. Now the bondholders, even though they've made a killing over the last 15 years with very high interest rates, again want to maximize on their profits. And the IMF's debt sustainability analysis, in my view, is complicit with these desires of the bondholders. So the IMF's DSA says that when Sri Lanka exits the IMF program in 2027, we would need to have debt servicing on the order of 4.5% of GDP. What does 4.5% of GDP mean? It would be at that time equivalent to about 30% of our revenues. In other words, we are consistently increasing our taxes, but 30% of that is going to be used to repay just the external creditors, the bondholders, the bilateral donors like China, India, Japan, and of course the multilateral agencies. Or to put it another way, it is going to be about the equivalent of 30% of our export revenue, because we have to collect this as revenue locally, but also it has to be repaid in foreign currency. So the whole export-led model, as it's spoken, 30% of that is also going to go to repay the creditors. So Sri Lanka is in that trap right now, and the IMF is overseeing it. What was even more cynical is that in the week before the presidential elections, and literally 2 days before the presidential election, former President Ranil Wickremesinghe comes out and says he sealed a deal with the bondholders. Now, 2 days before the elections, we go into a blackout period where there's no election campaigning that is allowed. And it is during that period that the former president announces that he's clinched a deal. And this deal is really in favor of the bondholders. We may only end up with about 10 to 12% in debt relief from the bondholders. Or it's only about 1.5 billion US dollars. Now think about this. In 2027, according to the IMF program, Sri Lanka is expected to start floating more of these international sovereign bonds, the equivalent of about 1.5 billion US dollars. In other words, just in 1 year, then we're going to borrow the same amount of debt relief that we get again from the bondholders. So this whole path of debt restructuring and the way in which this deal was made, these are the challenges that this new government is going to have to face. One, they can't provide any relief to the people immediately because of the stringent condition of a high primary budget surplus. And during their first term itself, they're going to have to start repaying these high levels of debt. And that could cause another crisis. If there is another shock, if global oil prices suddenly spike up, Sri Lanka may again default in 4 or 5 years.
Right. So who are the bondholders here, Aylan, exactly? Are they like private commercial banks, or like, who are these bondholders exactly with whom, say, this Ranil Wickremesinghe has struck a deal with? Or are they like China? Like who are they?
Yeah, these bondholders are big financial institutions, mainly in the West. So in New York and in London, the hedge funds, the mutual funds, they all invest in this kind of debt floated by countries like ours. So basically, Wall Street and the city of London, and their whole interest is to maximize their profits. So if I am to tell you a little bit about the structure of Sri Lanka's debt, for the bondholders, most of our debt was somewhere between 6 to 9% annual interest rates. Now, keep in mind, we floated this debt when interest rates in the West were close to 0%. So when you float such high interest debt and it's a 10-year loan, eventually almost, the interest payments itself become almost equivalent to the principal.
Right. So basically, these bondholders, if I understand correctly, they've already made a lot of returns, I mean, hefty returns on whatever they have lent, right?
That's right, yeah. And now they're trying to squeeze out.
Yeah. So it wouldn't be like a financial disaster, so to speak, if they were to give some amount of debt relief, taking into account Sri Lanka's economic situation right now.
Absolutely, because the reason why countries like Sri Lanka pay such a high interest is precisely because they claim that there is the risk of default, right? But once the default has happened, with the support of the IMF, they are again squeezing us to the point that Sri Lanka might go into repeated defaults and crises by having to repay so much of the debt.
Okay, so let me put this together. So on the one hand, these bondholders, they have already earned a really more than reasonable return on whatever they have lent, number one. Number two, on top of that, they want Sri Lanka to be squeezed even more to pay back whatever are the interest amounts due. Despite the fact that there was a risk of default factored into the interest rates which were applicable from Sri Lanka's point. And thirdly, the IMF has come into the picture to prod and nudge Sri Lanka into a situation where it will repeat the same thing again by going back to the same bondholders and issuing the sovereign bonds and then repeat the cycle over and over again. Is that correct?
That's pretty much the picture, because the IMF's debt sustainability analysis, where they say, okay, this is how Sri Lanka's debt is going to be sustainable into the future. In there itself, they say, starting in 2027, we are going to be floating 1.8% of our GDP in these international sovereign bonds. In other words, we have to service external creditors on the order of 4.5% of GDP. And how are we going to do that? We are going to borrow new debt at very high interest rates, so that out of that 4.5%, 1.8% is going to come from new debt from the same actors who have led us into this default and crisis.
Right. Okay. This reminds me of those old zamindari systems which you've had, bonded labor kind of a scenario. But coming to now that you have established the sort of economic trap which Sri Lanka is in, let's come to this Dissanayake's challenge now. How is he going to navigate this terrain, given the huge amount of expectations that people who have voted for him, even those who may not have voted for him, would certainly have from him? He has spoken about giving protections to the weak, to the marginalized, those who have really suffered the most, the working classes. Where is he going to find the money or even the economic policy space to address their pressing concerns, education, health, all the basic things, when you got to generate this 2.3% primary budget surplus? Is there a realistic chance that he can keep the IMF happy and keep his campaign promises as well? And if so, what does that policy terrain look like to you?
That is going to be a very difficult balance for him to find, because with such a severe austerity program from the IMF, there's very little wiggle room for him to provide relief to the people. And there's going to be political costs as well. There is tremendous pressure on Dissanayake to stick with the IMF program. That's the message from all the capitals, as far as I can see, whether it's Delhi, Washington, and so on. But then once this honeymoon period is over, there's also going to be mounting pressure on the street, because I mentioned that was the main reason for this overwhelming mandate. So the question is how they are going to manage both these political pressures. Now think about it. Dissanayake gets elected end of September, and within a week, the IMF is in town to try to make sure that he sticks with his program. The parliamentary election happens. Within a week, the IMF is again in Colombo. So it is that kind of a close watch and almost a stranglehold. And unless he can find a way out to slowly walk away from the IMF program, it's going to be very difficult to meet the aspirations of the people. So one question is, if he is to eventually move away from the IMF program, where will the development financing come from? What kind of a development model can this new government promote? There might be other things they can do, for example, releasing land or even land distribution. That does not affect the sort of budgetary constraints, but that is limited given that people really need cash relief at this moment. Employment generation, livelihoods would require a much bigger stimulus from the government. And I think that is going to be one of his central challenges, to try to chart a different economic path while not antagonizing the West and the various regional powers. And it is in this kind of a fine balance or the tightrope that he's walking where there are also probably a lot of actors waiting to see them fall. The elite in Colombo, our local capitalists or business class, they have many misgivings about this NPP government, and they will be looking for the first chance to undercut this government. And whether even the bureaucracy, particularly say the various arms of the bureaucracy that have been exposed quite a bit to the external sectors, whether it is the finance ministry, we've gone through a process of trade liberalization and free trade pacts, whether the commerce ministry, the bureaucrats there would cooperate with this new government. Would the new government be able to actually move the state machinery in a direction that they want? And then, of course, the really bloated security sector. So these are all major challenges for this government, and we are expecting them to convene parliament very soon, tomorrow, in fact, and what kind of policies they will take forward in the first 100 days will well determine whether they can keep the support of the people.
Right. So, Aylan, in this entire equation which you've mapped out, Sri Lanka's position, negotiating position vis-a-vis the IMF, I don't think they have the upper hand at all. So, and if you were to stick with the IMF route out of the current extreme situation, it seems like there is no other way except to follow the IMF diktats and go with the program. And if that happens, I don't see how Dissanayake's regime is going to be any different from what's come before. On the other hand, if there were to be a kind of a solution that involves walking away, or at least being prepared to walk away from the IMF, which might put you in a different situation in terms of negotiations, is there any kind of a roadmap or a vision laid out by any section of the Sri Lankan polity or the experts, which Dissanayake could probably, look to follow in terms of helping him implement his promises and so on, if the IMF route does not allow for that? Is there an alternative vision at all in place, an alternative to the IMF route?
I mean, there are always alternative routes. They have political costs. I think here, more than the support from the IMF provides 2.9 billion US dollars over 4 years, right? And as you mentioned at the beginning, it's a 337 million tranche every number of months. Now that just amounts to about 60 million US dollars a month. That's all they're getting from the IMF. Sri Lanka's foreign earnings every month are close to 1,800 million US dollars, 30 times that amount. So when people say Sri Lanka has got an IMF bailout, that is really a lie, right? There's no such thing as a bailout, and not just in Sri Lanka, in most countries. So why does Sri Lanka stick to this IMF path? One, because there's a lot of pressure to restructure the debt. And as I mentioned, the previous government at the last moment had, in fact, come through with this deal, and everything looks like this government is going to sign on to the deal, which will have very long-term impact. Now, after this debt restructuring is completed, Sri Lanka really does not need to go through these painful reviews and continue to take these tranches, because it's not that those funds that are important. It's about whether Sri Lanka will be able to muster the support of other countries to continue to try and find development financing, support in terms of trade, so that Sri Lanka can continue to export more and more of its goods and find better terms for its imports. So that whole foreign trade, foreign policy equation is also what is going to be deciding which way the president and the government can go. But for the moment, everything seems to be stacked against them, as I mentioned, with most of the larger powers insisting that the new government continue with the liberalization trajectory on the path of neoliberal policies, which, in my view, is what has brought Sri Lanka to this crisis in the first place.
Right. I mean, it's a very tough situation. On the one hand, it's really it's good to hear you say that there are alternatives which sort of would depend on Sri Lanka's ability to push changes in its foreign trade and foreign policy domains. But at the same time, there is this huge pressure, not just from the IMF, but also from every single important capital, especially in the West and also in the neighborhood, to continue with the IMF program of the neoliberal reform agenda. So, Aylan, it's pretty clear that on the economic front, he's in a pretty tight spot, and it'll be a real surprise if he's able to break out of the stranglehold of the bondholders, the creditors, who are sort of dictating the policy space for him. Now, moving away from the economy, if you look at the larger political and social situation, there is this collective sentiment which is yearning for a systemic change, which is what has probably, played a key role in sweeping him into the national mainstream and his presidency and now this parliamentary majority. So, do you think AKD will be able to use his two-thirds majority to push for some constitutional changes? What kind of options do you think this two-thirds majority is going to give him in terms of bringing in some transformative changes, so that there is some kind of permanency to a change in political culture? Like in the 1970s, we had Jayawardene bring in this executive presidency. That is something which is on everybody's mind. So is there something which he can do to reverse it, maybe do other things as well? I just wanted you to know your thoughts on this. Yeah.
Sampath, so it's still not clear to many of us which way or what policies this government is going to take forward, because up to now, they were only focused on capturing power. So they hardly made any clear messages about what they would do after coming to power. Now, they have said that they will abolish the executive presidency, and with a two-thirds majority and the kind of current state of the country, if they decide to move on that quickly, they will be able to do that. They have said that they will work towards a new constitution.
Just sorry to interrupt, Alan. If he does that, he's the president, okay? If he does move to abolish the executive presidency, will that affect his powers? Is the way he can function? Would a little more power go to the prime minister? Like, how is that sort of boomerang on his existing capabilities and powers?
I mean, the way I understand it is, because they have a 2/3 majority, and it's not even a coalition government, right? Their party has a 2/3 majority. Even if they abolish the executive presidency and he becomes then the prime minister, he would effectively be an executive prime minister, right? That would be able to do more or less all that they can do, because the entire cabinet would be from their party. So in that sense, at least during the first term or this term that they are in power, it shouldn't make any difference. The executive presidency, and the reason why in the past the presidents don't change it is also because then they're thinking of the next term. And whether, just like in this election, if then the president wins a second term, then the parliament will be favorable and so on. So it really depends on their political calculation and how much they will stick to the principle of democratizing the country. But the executive presidency is part of a larger problem with our constitutional order, right? To what extent they are in favor of devolving power, what extent they are open to the idea of power sharing and getting greater representation of people from the periphery, from the minorities, and so on.
But Sri Lanka has a proportionate representation system, right? So what is the problem in getting representation for people from the peripheries and the minorities?
So what Sri Lanka doesn't have, for example, is like a second chamber, like your Rajya Sabha, for example, right? So if certain laws are being passed in parliament, if there could be a check, and there have been proposals in Sri Lanka because there's been a long constitutional debate that has paralleled the ethnic conflict in terms of a solution, is to have another chamber with greater representation for the marginalized, so that they could at least ensure that no discriminatory policies are passed and so on and so forth. So that would be in terms of power sharing, or to take governance more closer to the people. So with the Indo-Lanka Accord, the provincial council system was created. And now, what powers should be in the provincial councils, because also the economy, a lot has changed in almost 40 years since the Indo-Lanka Accord and the 13th Amendment. So a lot of that has to be debated. But I think in general, if you think of the minorities, my sense is that rather than these exact constitutional clauses, what people are looking for is a recognition that the country has a tragic history. Minorities haven't been treated equally.
By minorities, do you mean the Tamils and the Muslims? Is that what you basically?
Tamil, yeah, mainly the Tamils and the Muslims, but also really the people who have been most oppressed, in my view, are the hill country Tamils, the indentured labor brought over from India to work in the plantations over the last 200 years. In 1948, when we got independence, they were even disenfranchised. Their citizenship was taken away. And educationally, in terms of employment, in terms of access to land, they are extremely marginalized. And it's also remarkable that the NPP did very well in those regions in this election, in the hill country. So to be able to address all these grievances, and it has to also be in the context of speaking to the Sinhala periphery, the rural Sinhala constituencies, because what we've seen over the last 4.5 decades of what we call in Sri Lanka open economy policies, or what internationally is known as neoliberal globalization, is this huge increase in inequality between Colombo and the rest. So whether he would be able to address all of that in terms of the economic situation, in terms of access to land, but also in terms of governance, is something that is to be seen. It's really hard to predict, what they plan to do, and hopefully in the next couple of months that picture will become clear to us.
Right. On this question of changes in political culture and so on, Aylan, I want to also ask you, the entire the Rajapaksa, the various brothers, when they were in charge, there was this militant, Sinhala Buddhist ethnocracy or ethno-nationalism, which had become pretty extreme. So, do you think AKD's term Sri Lanka will emerge out of this? I mean, where does he stand with regard to this ethno-nationalism kind of ethos that has been dominant? Is he like moving away from that, or is he ready to play with that to suit his political ends? What kind of trajectory do you see?
No, definitely the signs are that they completely want to move away from that and they want to take the country away from that. In fact, what was significant in the recent elections is that for the first time, the sort of Sinhala Buddhist card was not used by any actor because it was also not gaining any traction. The worry is, though, that if this NPP government fails, then that might create the context for the re-emergence, as we've seen around the world, kind of a polarizing chauvinist regime. So there's a lot at stake in terms of ensuring that this new government succeeds in this direction.
Right. We're running out of time again. One last question, Aylan, before we let go. In terms of foreign policy, where do you think Dissanayake is headed? Because he's coming to India in mid-December, according to news reports today. So he's going to be meeting Prime Minister Modi, and I'm sure at some point he will be making a similar trip to China, or maybe elsewhere. He might meet President Xi as well. So you also mentioned earlier that foreign trade and foreign policy shifts might be crucial if he's going to generate some kind of maneuvering space vis-a-vis the IMF conditionalities. So, what do you think are his objectives should be, if not likely to be? That is something in the realm of speculation. But in terms of at least what is necessary for Sri Lanka's economic revival, where do you think he's going to be looking at in terms of foreign trade and foreign policy initiatives?
Yeah, I think first of all, Sri Lanka has paid a huge price because of the geopolitical tensions in the region and over our country, right? So Sri Lanka, in my view, can never gain by playing one regional power against another. It will always end up in disaster. So in terms of a foreign policy, even though it's not the same context at all, I think we need to again rethink a kind of a non-aligned foreign policy, even though there isn't that kind of a non-aligned movement at the current moment. So that I think they have to be really focused on, because the world is such that we are seeing it again more and more polarized with a return of Trump. It's likely to get even worse. To stay neutral, even though they will be dragged in different directions. The other kind of lesson the last few decades for Sri Lanka is that what are called development or development projects or investment, they really haven't helped Sri Lanka. Various powerful actors, whether it is bilateral donors, whether it's China, India, or even Japan, or the multilateral donors, the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, they come and give projects and we willingly accept them. There is no proper planning, there is no vision of the kind of development that is suitable for Sri Lanka. And so that is something that this government very quickly needs to get its act together in terms of, okay, this is the direction in which we want to take forward our development, and we will only take development assistance which goes with our plan. This is something that Sri Lanka has miserably failed over the last 4 or 5 decades. So that is one. So when I think even when it goes to Delhi, it is also about strengthening political relations with the regional power, but also trying to kind of have the kind of discussions about the kind of transfer of, whether it be technology, the kind of investment that would lead to getting us out of this economic crisis. So to be able to increase employment, because what has been called foreign direct investment in Sri Lanka, and it's a minimal amount, somewhere between 1 to 2 billion US dollars every year. But in my view, 70 to 80% of that is just speculative investment in real estate. It only aggravates these crisis conditions. It does not lead to employment generation. So to be able to speak at a very high level.
Like what industries do you think Sri Lanka could really look to grow? I mean, one of the reasons for the crisis, which sort of kicked off with COVID, the pandemic, was its excessive reliance on tourism, right? I mean, like, are there any other like indigenous direction for industrial growth and diversification which has been identified, which you think the new regime could pursue in its talks with neighboring powers?
Yeah. So one, of course, given the current crisis, we really need to focus on agriculture and our food system, at least to be self-sufficient. As I mentioned, there's malnutrition on the rise. We are really going through a food crisis. So even on things like that, I mean, there can be a lot of appropriate technology for agricultural value addition that we can gain from countries like India or even from Southeast Asia. We probably have some potential to create a boat building industry, because we're an island nation, whether it is for fisheries or for even the export of smaller crafts, there is possibility. So there are a number of possibilities, but what we've lacked in Sri Lanka is the political will and foresight to stay on the path of diversifying our economy. And as you mentioned, tourism has been a disaster. It sucks in a lot of investment, but it also creates a certain dependency on countries that provide our tourists. And in my view, that is one reason why, again, the World Bank and the powers that be encourage countries like Sri Lanka to go into tourism, because it creates a dependency. So there needs to be a radical rethinking of our economic policy trajectory, but that needs to come in tune with the kind of foreign relations that we can build. And it's not all about mega projects. I think we could do much better in working with India, for example, on much smaller projects that actually lead to local production and employment.
Right. I mean, there is a lot of, I think, thinking also that needs to be done, clarity achieved on the part of the Dissanayake government and his cabinet colleagues. I think, and as you rightly pointed out, I think political clarity, in addition to political will, has been sort of lacking in all these years, which I think probably played a role in sort of leading Sri Lanka to where it is today. I really appreciated your observations and insights on the economy, the politics, and the electoral side of recent developments in Sri Lanka. Aylan, thank you so much once again for coming on this show and sharing your, as always, very interesting insights and illuminating thoughts on this. Thank you so much. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Sampath. It was also a pleasure on my part.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.